So thank you, Rob, for that very generous introduction. Hello, everyone. I want to continue by opening with some thanks first to the Rachel Carson Center for hosting my wife and me this summer. It's been great so far. Second, to my family, who has actually traveled all the way from Singapore to spend some time with us here in Munich. And third, to you, the audience, for coming out to hear me talk about my work today, and I really appreciate it, and welcome your questions and feedback. Today I'll be introducing you to the book that I'm currently writing, A History of Fossil Fuels and the Rise of Technocratic Regimes in Early 20th Century East Asia. I've prepared a brief handout with an outline of the talk, a timeline of events, and a map with the places I mentioned all marked out. So does everyone have a copy of that handout? Okay. Seems so. Okay, so we'll get started then. So we inhabit a world that carbon made. The widespread harnessing of fossil fuel energy in the 19th century transformed the nature of work and enabled the production of completely new ways of life. This was, in the words of historical demographer E.A. Wrigley, a shift from the organic to mineral economy. It meant breaking through the limits of growth imposed by earlier energy regimes of wood, wind, water, and human and animal muscle. Coal-powered mass industrial manufacturing, long-distance transport by rail and sea, and unprecedented urban expansion. In so doing, it gave rise to the social technical assemblage with which we are still familiar today. To historian of China, Kenneth Pomerantz, differing access to coal was a key variable in explaining the great divergence between the economies of China and Europe as they entered the modern age. But coal did more than just rebuild the material foundations of human society. It also allowed for new kinds of politics. My project studies such dynamics as they played out in East Asia in the first half of the 20th century. It argues that coal and carbon energy was central to Chinese and Japanese experiences with global industrial modernity and to the rise of trans-war East Asian technocratic regimes. I ground my inquiry in Fushun, marked with an X on the map here, a mining town in northeast China, a region once commonly referred to as Manchuria. And just to give you a sense of size, Manchuria is roughly the size of France and Germany together in terms of landmass. Fushun boasted East Asia's largest coal mining operations, and on account of this, earned itself the moniker Coal Capital. Through the history of Fushun, I explore how Chinese and Japanese states and their subsidiaries, which had at different times extended control over the site, participated in the co-production of calorific and political power. The result, a particular kind of politics I call carbon technocracy, is the subject of my book. So the political economy of energy has attracted much interest of late. And here we have one of many political cartoons that you might find to sort of tease out this particular relationship. But with concerns abounding over such matters as peak oil, climate change, and risks of nuclear power, our patterns of energy generation and use have been subject to increasingly greater scrutiny. Energy in these analyses tend to be thought of in terms of economic rent, political capital, and environmental externalities. They focus on the monetary value of energy resources to states and corporations, the domestic and international politics of access to these resources, and the impact of their production and consumption on the environment. Energy emerges from such narratives as power that's not only motive in that it does work, but also political. It is, in this sense, yes, both this capacity to do work and the ability to influence outcomes. And this is a power, we are reminded, that comes at a great environmental cost. What is often missing from these accounts, though, is the act of translation, to use Bruno Latour's terms. How does one get from energy resources to political power? One way is to look at the meanings ascribed to energy and the imaginaries that it animates, and embedded in discourses of development, ideals of autarky, and fears of scarcity. Energy is often situated squarely in debates on the national economy and the role of the state in promoting its growth. But another way is an attentiveness to materiality. Apart from taking note of what it is that energy does, it is instructive to also consider its physical properties, how these affect the manner in which it moves and is moved, and the implications that such have for control. My project features and factors in both the material and the discursive while assuming the permeability of the boundary between the two. Material and discursive were to come together in Fushun, and here I'll briefly walk us through the history of this site. Coal mining had been carried out in the area since around the 12th century. It was, however, banned during the Qing dynasty, the last dynasty to rule over China. The reason given at that time was ostensibly geomantic. Fushun lay in close proximity to several imperial mausoleums, and the digging for coal was thought to threaten the ley lines, or the feng shui, if you will, of these sites. Around the turn of the 20th century, though, the pressures of imperialistic geopolitics, domestic disturbances, and reconstruction costs prompted the cash-strapped Qing government to allow enterprising local merchant officials to begin mining in Fushun. Within a matter of months, the coal mines of Fushun also drew in considerable amounts of Russian capital that was flowing into the region at that time. It was in large part on the grounds of this capital and Russian shareholding that the Japanese Empire would claim for itself these mines, along with Russian railway concessions in South Manchuria after its victory in the Russo-Japanese War. Over the next 4 decades, the Fushun coal mines would be owned and operated by the powerful semi-governmental South Manchuria Railway Company, or Mantetsu, an enterprise that's often compared, even at that time, to the British East India Company. Under Mantetsu management, it grew into a formidable mining enterprise, the biggest in China, the Japanese Empire, and indeed all of East Asia. Its annual output reached close to 10 million tons, and its payroll came to include more than 50,000 workers. Fushun was also a site of a number of firsts for Japan. Japanese engineers and scientists introduced to Fushun technologies that yet to be tested out in the home islands. It was, in this sense, a laboratory of empire. The most notable of these technologies was open-pit mining, and Mantetsu first excavated Fushun's iconic open-pit mines in 1917. Later, in the early 1920s, it invited mining engineers from the Minnesotan Iron Range to help expand operations, bringing to being the gargantuan excavations for which it would become famous. If you go to China, anywhere in China today, and you mention Fushun, the first thing they would say is, oh yes, the open-pit mines. And so that's where the iconic image had emerged. In the 1920s, Fushun also became the site of Japan's first shale oil plant. The thick coal beds were overlain by layers of shale rock, which were removed as overburden with the introduction of open-pit mining. As concerns over Japan's paucity of petroleum resources emerged in the aftermath of the First World War, Mantetsu officials, military men, and energy policy analysts would look to extract liquid fuel from Fushun shale rock as a promising solution to the looming fuel famine. It's also a site where they experimented with synthetic petroleum through coal liquefaction, and this I can take up in the Q&A. Following the fall of the Japanese Empire in 1945, Fushun and its coal mines came briefly under the control of the Chinese nationalist government and its technocratic National Resources Commission. While it was not until 1946 that the nationalists secured the colliery, Fushun featured in energy considerations for more than a decade prior. The dumping of Fushun coal on the Shanghai markets in the early 1930s prompted Chinese coal producers to agitate for intervention by the nationalist state, particularly through protective tariffs. In addition, Fushun, as a mining metropolis par excellence, also served as a model upon which the nationalists would manage their state-owned mines in the years leading up to and through the war, in anticipation for the reacquisition of the industrial Northeast and Fushun along with it. Fushun was taken over by the Chinese Communists towards the end of the Chinese Civil War, and the Fushun colliery featured prominently in the developmental initiatives of the new socialist state, most notably in its ambitious first 5-year plan. Through this, it was to embody for the Chinese Communist government, as it did for its predecessors, the relentless pursuit of the industrial modern ideal. While my study uses the case of Fushun to unpack the relationship between various Chinese and Japanese regimes and their energy resources, it also seeks to contribute to a broader discussion about the interplay of energy and politics. In his recent Carbon Democracy, Timothy Mitchell provides an imaginative rereading of this particular energy politics dynamic. In his analysis, coal, along with the steam engine and iron, brought into being a new social technical system in which energy, now consumed at exponential rates, was transported along narrow channels of water and rail and concentrated in expanding urban centers. Both the narrowness of the networks and the concentration at the nodes made this assemblage vulnerable to disruptions, and workers involved in the mining and movement of coal were able to exploit these points of weakness and seize for themselves various political rights and concessions. These democratic spaces that had opened, Mitchell goes on to argue, were closed off, however, with the coming of the oil age, in which energy flows were directed less by the hands of workers and more by carefully calibrated technical structures of wells, pumps, and pipes. Influenced in part by Mitchell's work, I too have followed the coal out of the ground and traced the implications that its extraction, transportation, and distribution had politically. In trans-war East Asia, though, the path that coal took led not so much to democratic possibilities as it did to technocratic imaginaries. Now, a few words on technocracy are in order because it shows up quite a fair bit in sort of the manuscript that I'm writing. Technocracy is typically defined as being the rule of experts, the governance and control of society or industry by bearers of technical knowledge. In my account, I further understand it as involving interrelated ideas about the unquestionable superiority of the scientific method in framing and solving the problems of society, and the necessity for central directives and state planning to bring that method to bear on problems identified. These ideas are further tied to additional organizing principles, including the equating of efficiency with efficacy under the rubric of rationalization, the privileging of mechanization and the substitution of subjective man by objective machine, and the idealization of industrialization as the means by which a society reaches the teleological endpoint that is modernity, the industrial modern. While technocracy may have never been realized entirely in form, if one thinks of it purely as a government by engineers, of engineers, for engineers, by engineers, there were numerous instances across the 20th century in which technocratic visions of modernist futures seized the imaginations of those who saw from the standpoint of the state, and in so doing shaped the societies upon which they were projected. The impetus for technocratic control over the coal industry can be found, first of all, in the growing demand for carbon energy that accompanied the steady expansion of urban centers and the industrial sector. Coal became increasingly important and indeed indispensable to the world that it helped build. Now, if the system was, as Mitchell argues, vulnerable to organized labor, then the need to secure a steady stream of that fundamental fuel prompted moves to mitigate those vulnerabilities. One solution was mechanization. With the greater capacity for work that fossil fuel-powered machines had over human muscle, the adoption allowed for a reduction in the size of the labor force, and with that, as the logic went, so too was the risk of unrest and disrupted energy flows lowered. In Fushun, mechanization reached its most visible expression in open-pit mining. A new environment that open-pit mining created consisted not only of much labor-saving heavy machinery, from line dredgers to power shovels, but also of a workforce that was more visible and hence more easily monitored as miners were brought from the subterranean depths to the surface. The panoptic gaze that Michel Foucault had identified in the regulatory institutions of the modern age extended to this site of extraction with similarly disciplining effects. I don't really have time to go into all the various technologies of control here, but I can take this up in Q&A. Some of the interesting ones for workers include fingerprinting and calorie counting, and so we can talk about that later. But the beginning of the 1930s marks a turning point in my story, and I want to provide here a brief account from the 30s to the 50s to show how carbon technocracy played out in East Asia in this trans-war period. On September 18th, 1931, Japanese army officers stationed in Manchuria sparked off what was known as the Mukden Incident. They blew up Mantetsu railway tracks, blamed this act on the Chinese, and initiated an invasion of Manchuria that ended with the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo. The concession had become a colony. In response to this, Chinese merchants, particularly in Shanghai, there we go, which was the center of Chinese industry and business, began boycotting Japanese products, including coal from Fushun. Mantetsu sought a market for Fushun coal that was originally Shanghai-bound, and ended up selling this back in the home islands instead. When they did so, they undercut domestic producers considerably. This exacerbated problems that small and medium-sized Japanese coal mining firms were already facing from the Great Depression, with unsustainable operation costs, workers laid off, and forced mine closures. Japanese mining associations protested, particularly in the mining hub of Fukuoka in Kyushu, and I have it marked here. There are two main hubs for coal mining in Japan, one in sort of the southwest and one in the north in Hokkaido. And the Japanese Ministry of Industry and Ministry for Colonial Affairs stepped in and put in place quotas on the import of Fushun coal. So you see this way in which there's this kind of contradiction within even the political economy of the empire itself. The involvement of the Japanese state in such a dispute is not surprising. It was nevertheless largely unprecedented in the hitherto self-regulating energy sector. This marked the beginning of greater state involvement in the economy that started in the 1930s. Now, the story of the expanding role of the Japanese state in economic affairs during this period is a familiar tale. Here's some of the protests that took place, newspaper articles on the protests that took place at that time. But the late political scientist Chalmers Johnson saw this expansion of the state as a starting point for the trans-war developmental state in Japan, in which the government was at the forefront of macroeconomic planning. The desire to control the coal industry was testament to its importance to the post-depression economy and its powering of Japan's industrial and manufacturing sectors, which made considerable gains over the decade. To put a number on it, in 1935, coal accounted for about 60% of total energy consumed, with hydroelectric power at about 20 and oil 10. In nationalist China, the government under Chiang Kai-shek too pursued a course of state-led development in which the carbon-hungry heavy industries were given top priority. The establishment of the National Resources Commission was an attempt by the nationalist state to bring science and engineering to the management of the industrial economy, from steel, electricity, roads, railways, machinery, and arms, to the coal that fueled the manufacturing of these products. Ideologically, the industrial policy drew from the developmental ideas of the by then deceased father of the Chinese Revolution, Sun Yat-sen. In his 1922 industrial plan, which provided the blueprint for nationalist economic planning, Sun laid out a comprehensive program to, in his words, turn China from the dumping ground for overproduction to the economic ocean capable of absorbing surplus capital from industrial nations and their productive processes, end quote. Coal within this framework was, and I quote again, a necessity for civilized community and the sinews of modern industry, end quote. And his calls for the opening of new mines and the development of the coal mining industry through scientific investigation were heeded by those at the technocratic helm of the nationalist state. In Manchuria, the client state of Manchukuo, established and backed by Japan, too was set on a developmental course that was cut from a similar cloth. The state's official economic charter contended that because capitalism unchecked would lead to calamity, it was necessary to introduce national controls so as to allow for a strong development of the people's economy as a whole. Among the regulations that it laid out were, one, national ownership of heavy industries relating to the military or the provision of public goods, and secondly, the principle of one industry, one company. It's quite self-explanatory, but what this was the idea that there should be only one business or company per industry type, eliminating the inefficiencies that emerged from capitalistic competition. The Manchurian coal industry was subjected to this plan, and in accordance with the one industry, one company principle, the Manchurian Coal Company, or Mantan for short, was set up by the Manchukuo government and Mantetsu, with each party investing about 8 million yen into its establishment. The express objectives of this new company included Planning the development of resources, preventing meaningless competition between producers. 3, attempting to keep coal prices low. And 4, selecting the most suitable users for various coals based on their quality, physical properties, and under the rubric of scientific principles. Mantan was slated to take over Fushun, but faced vehement opposition. Of note was the dissenting opinion of Kubo Toru, then head of the colliery. His was a defense of the enterprise's independence that drew on his own technical expertise as a coal mining engineer with decades of experience on the ground, or in this case perhaps in the ground. Kubo fiercely defended Fushun's independence from the encroachment of the technocratic colonial state. While there were some industries such as the telegraph, telephone, and railway that might be suited for becoming government enterprises, this was not something he asserted for the coal industry. The main reason was environmental. It lay in the geophysical variance of coal fields. In his words, and I'll read it quickly here, in coal mining, the object upon which one works is the coal seam. But coal seams differ in infinite ways, be they buried near or deep or near the surface of the earth, thick or thin, or it could be an issue of angles of incline, faults and folds, the amount of impurities in the coal, the quality of the coal itself, or of gas, coal dust, naturally occurring fires, the hardness or softness, strength or weakness of the rock, presence of water, ground pressure, and so on. And correspondingly, in order to then mine these coal seams, there's a wide range of equipment, materials, labor, and business management practices that need to be marshaled. And because of that, there cannot just be some general regulation of operations across the board. Now, the proponents of nationalization of the coal industry under a single system, Kubo complained, lacked basic technical understanding and actual industry experience. Kubo's dissenting opinion was echoed by other leaders in the coal mining industry who too saw the government and military as deficient in the knowledge and experience to tackle the challenge facing the sector. In this way, if technical expertise and scientific rationalization were tenets to which those who called for industrial control would appeal, then these two were principles that could and were used against them and their centralizing efforts. With the outbreak of the Pacific War by the end of 1941, the Japanese Empire's war machine started to crave more and more coal resources, much of which went towards fueling the production of other raw materials and powering munitions factories. With the acquisition of new territories, new resources were brought under Japanese control. But these new sites too were consumers of energy, and the circulation and distribution of coal resources became a cause for concern among imperial planners. Manchuria and Fushun in particular were designated as a major node in this cross-crossing network of planned carbon energy flows. And here it's sort of a diagrammatic representation of this map where we have the various coal capacities of these colonial sites and the home islands itself, and a centralized planning that would take the whole sort of eastern seaboard of the Asian continent. In spite of the best efforts by Japanese technocratic planners and industry leaders, though, wartime production fell quite short of projected goals. In Manchuria, this was attributed to persistent problems with labor and shortages of technical personnel. At the Fushun coal mines, production steadily declined over the course of those years, falling from its peak of about 9.5 million tons in 1936 to about 2.5 million in 1945 at war's end. One war, however, was to be soon followed by another, and the nationalists and communists resumed the fighting that they had temporarily suspended in an effort to form a united front to resist the Japanese. Manchuria was their primary battleground. In the years between 1945 and 1948, Fushun changed hands several times among the Soviets, nationalists, and communists amidst the turmoil of the Chinese Civil War. An engineer sent by the National Resources Commission to Fushun to retake it from the Japanese, for instance, was murdered by Soviets or communist spies, and both parties would point the finger of blame at each other. Early in the morning of October 31st, 1948, following a night pierced by gunshots and cannon fire, the communist troops finally overpowered their nationalist foes, entered Fushun, and claimed it liberated. The preceding years of chaos and war had not been kind to Fushun's coal mining industry. The damage of the mines had sustained included about 70 kilometers of collapsed mine shafts and millions of cubic meters of flooding. Multiple mining tunnels had been sealed off to contain fires that were broken out within. Fires, it was rumored that fleeing Japanese and nationalist soldiers had started. Production ground to a halt. Recovery called for Herculean efforts, but by 1952, Fushun was back on its feet and taking bold strides, proceeded in step with the new socialist state's plans for large-scale Soviet-style industrialization, most notably the first five-year plan. Now, this plan sought to provide, in the words of its chief architect, Li Fushun, the material basis for socialism through the production of modern industrial equipment to transform industry itself, as well as tractors and modern farm machines to mechanize agriculture, all manner of vehicles to restructure transport and communication, and modern weapons to arm soldiers at the front lines of national defense. All these production processes depended on access to energy, particularly energy from coal, and many initiatives targeted increasing the output of this resource. The centrality of coal to the industrializing Chinese economy is evidenced by two figures from 1960. Coal accounted for about 80% of electric power production, and about 90% of that 80% went towards heavy industry, and more than 90% of total energy consumption that year. Now, Fushun's course through the late 1940s and the 50s was steered by its established position as a site for energy extraction. It became a center for technological innovation under socialist science and of mass campaigns to meet increasingly unrealistic revolutionary targets. It drew the attention of the chairman himself, and Mao visited Fushun in 1958 to celebrate its contributions to the project of socialist industrialization. And here he's sort of pointing to this fat-bellied Buddha that's carved out of coal, and said, "Oh, look, if you don't work, you become all rotund like this particular figure." Mao himself was no lightweight. In any case, as the 1950s drew to a close, this place, Fushun, the coal capital, was slowly outclassed by other new mines. Still, Fushun's coal, and to a lesser extent its shale oil and electric power industries, were to continue to provide much energy to Communist China's subsequent industrial plans. Now, the mobilization of Fushun's energy enterprise, more complete, more invasive as it may have been under the Chinese communists, with its preoccupation with sheer extraction versus long-term sustainability, did not look all too different from the resource management model of the Japanese Mantetsu or the Chinese Nationalist Resources Commission. So, the world that coal made, with growing urban centers, mass production, and increased connectivity, shaped and in some sense standardized what constituted development in the modern era. While they were to differ on finer points such as the distribution of wealth, the rights of workers within the system, and the extent to which the government should own the means of production, the Imperial Japanese, Chinese nationalists, and Chinese communist states converged on a particular industrial modern ideal. This was one in which the road to national wealth and power was paved by the rapid expansion of industry and industrial productivity, particularly through the mechanization of work. If machines did indeed become the measure of man for Europeans in their encounters with Asians in the early modern world, as Michael Adas has argued, then they were to remain a yardstick for East Asian elites and experts who often saw themselves as lagging behind more industrialized economies. Coal and other fossil fuels as key inputs into the engines of this particular brand of development became inseparable from the larger project of governance. Concerns over the production of these energy resources preoccupied state planners. Industry leaders too would welcome state intervention in many instances, especially if the main cause of their poor performance was external competition. But state involvement under carbon technocracy involved more than just ensuring the domestic producers maintain their market share. Through the 1930s and into the 1950s, East Asian states introduced aspects of a control economy that extended into the energetic base that was the coal industry. Appealing to much cherished but often poorly defined principles of scientific rationalization, state planners put forward initiatives such as the cartelization of major firms, nationalization under state companies, standardization of mining practices, and the setting of production quotas as part of statist five-year plans. However, while carbon technocracy did indeed take root in these various developmental states, to assume that it bore perfect fruit would be to buy into the fiction of technocracy itself. As points in the preceding narrative have tried to show, there were instances of slippage in which even the best laid plans for the control of coal's carbon energy were ultimately foiled. Among the contradictions within East Asian carbon technocracy is the tension between the fear of scarcity and a seemingly unshakable faith in the inexhaustibility of certain bodies of resources, such as the coal seams of Fushun. Sometimes spoken of in terms of supplying Japan for decades or even centuries, and at times talked about in both Chinese and Japanese discourses as limitless, Fushun's coal deposits filled fantasies about endless supplies of energy. If there were limits, this line of thinking went, then these were set by the inaptitude of human artifice and the attempts made to improve on factor inputs from technology to labor so as to better draw from a well that was presumed bottomless. This well has, however, begun to dry up. At the beginning of my talk, I referenced the work of Kenneth Pomeranz, who saw this deferring access to coal as a decisive factor explaining the great divergence between China and the West. Now, with China's growing economy and appetite for energy, we are witnessing something approaching a great convergence, but with rather chilling implications. It's evident to us now that capitalism cannot be separated from carbon in real terms, even if the market is structured to ignore its costs. In this way, the reconvergence between China and the West may very well involve hefty costs that only become fully visible in historical time. While we are more than half a century away from the events described in this talk, there are striking similarities between the discourses and practices of those times and how people in China, Japan, and indeed much of our contemporary world talk about and act on matters of energy today. From industrial development, economic growth, and national interests, to technocratic management, scientific rationalization, and the ideal of inexhaustibility, the terms of engagement have not changed by much. If the past is, as historian David Lowenthal has suggested, a foreign country, then it's one whose culture we do share. It may very well be that our relationship with energy is intrinsic to our modern condition. That is, it speaks not only to the fact that we are trying to master resources that are depleted at a rate much faster than they're being replenished, but it's also testament to the centrality of energy to our modern lives. Thank you.